Welcome back, fellow ranterinos. Today's rant is about kite lines and line length, more importantly. A lot of people don't consider line length too much, but I think it's a pretty big factor in how your kite flies, and depending on your weight, your size, and what you're trying to do on the water, could be a very important thing to think about more. In general, line length does two main things. One, it pushes your kite further into the wind because there's less drag on the lines the shorter the lines get. And two, it makes the power zone that your kite can move through smaller. Many people say that using shorter lines will make your kite less powerful. It would be like flying a smaller kite. Now, whilst you can ride shorter lines in more wind, like it's a smaller kite, it's not actually making your kite less powerful. If you have a 9-meter kite, it's still a 9-meter kite. What shorter lines is doing is just making the wind window smaller and making your kite push into the wind further. With these two things combined, you can ride a bigger kite in stronger wind, but your kite is not less powerful. Another thing to remember is that wind is typically not as strong lower down to the water, so when you have shorter lines, you're not up in cleaner air with stronger wind as you would with longer lines. I can't simply generalize and tell you what line length you must use. Even if you weigh the same as me and you're riding the same discipline, if you're riding a different kite, that makes a massive difference. Because different styles or types of kites will sit further back into the window or fly further forward in the wind, and that plays big time on what length lines will work best for whatever you're doing. I can speak for myself and say that I weigh 85 kilos, and if I'm riding freestyle or park on a kite like the Amp, I typically use 25-meter lines. Now that's longer than the standard length, and that's longer than what many people ride, but it's because I'm heavier. A heavier person pushes their kite forward into the wind more, and the little bit of longer lines at 25 instead of 23 help sit it back in the wind a little bit more, which makes it more stable and steady and gives me a better power stroke to get going and to stay going after I do a trick. Now, if I were a lighter person, like 65 or 70 kilos, 25-meter lines might not feel that good, depending upon what I want the kite to perform like. If I wanted more slack, I would use shorter lines. I would use 23 or maybe even 22, all the way maybe even down to 20-meter lines if I was a really light rider and I wanted to get a lot more slack with my kite. As I say, it really depends on the kite type that you're using. You need to feel what you want out of the kite. If your kite's got too much tension, then maybe using shorter lines is a good idea for you in freestyle. If your kite gets slack way too easily and you don't ever feel like you have enough power and you're just riding too big a size all the time, using a longer length of lines might help your riding style. Really, it's up to you to try and decide what you want to do with line length. You need to see what you think you're missing in your riding or what you would like to have in your riding, and then just adapt to that. I typically also use 23 or 25-meter lines on the wave kites like the Rio or the Enduro. And this is because I like to have more power stroke, so I can use a smaller kite in lighter winds, and also so I have more time for the kite to fall out of the sky and catch again when I'm doing a bottom turn or top turn in more onshore conditions. Shorter lines, generally, if your kite starts falling, you have less time and it's not gonna drift downwind as easily. Longer lines on a wave kite have more drag, and the drag on the lines actually helps the kite drift. Some people prefer shorter lines when they're riding in the waves, and this is because they want the kite to be faster and more reactive, and they want to swoop the kite around more while they're riding. So as I say, it really depends on your riding style. I'm more of a drift and park type wave rider, so the longer length of lines I think suits that style of riding better. It's actually a pretty similar feeling to what it's like riding in the kite park with longer lines. Line length has also changed a lot over the years. I remember when I was learning, I didn't actually know what length lines I had, but I've looked it up recently because I still have those lines, and they were like 30 meters long. And I even had some leader lines of about 2 meters on the end. So I was riding around 32 meter lines, which is so ridiculous. I would never ride that length lines now. And I think back then that was pretty common. Like Slingshot, I remember their main line length back in the day was around 27 meters, and they used to have around a meter leader, so they had about 28 meter lines on a lot of kites. These days, I think a normal length lines is around 22 to 23 meters. That seems to be where most brands are kind of sitting. Some of them have the little extra extension on the end, so you could go from 17 to 21 or 22 or 18 to 23 or 22. I think that's a pretty good idea. I guess some people are thinking about short lines, kite loops, foiling. What length lines would I use or should you use for that type of riding? And that's obviously just personal as well. I think that if you want to ride short lines, really you need to ride around 15 meters or less to kind of feel like you're riding short lines. If you're riding above 15 and between 15 to 20, I don't think feels that great. I would say for me that's just a length that's not really worth doing. I don't see the benefits of riding like 18 meter lines, for example. If I'm foiling and I want to ride short lines, I think riding something around 10 meters is pretty good. That seems to be like the best middle ground for still having some usable wind range, but just having a lot of fun with shorter lines. I'll often ride 7 meter lines as well if it's windy and I really just want to play around with short lines on the foil. 7 meter lines or 5 or 6 meter lines is when it gets really hard to ride. Unless you're an advanced kiter, I don't actually think you'd be able to ride on 7 meter lines. I think 10 meters around the minimum if you're riding a twin tip that most people will be able to ride. And some people, unless they're decently skilled, still probably won't be able to make 10 meter lines work. When you're riding short lines on a twin tip and even on a foil to get started, you need to be really aggressive with the kite. So you want to make sure you have good kite skills and kite handling before attempting that. If you're not a particularly good rider and you know your kite skills aren't that great, I wouldn't suggest trying to go out on short lines. I think you're just going to have a bad time, and you'd be better off just spending more time learning how to ride more standard length of lines first. Line length is definitely a super underrated aspect in kiteboarding that you can play with. I think more people should be playing around with different length lines and just trying out, seeing what it does, because it's a new way to have fun on the water. If you're bored of riding and you don't know what to do next, just using shorter lines might be the thing you need to spice it up and keep having fun. I guess this didn't really turn out to be that much of a rant, huh? One thing I do find a bit silly is that kite brands tend to just use one length of line for every kite, every style of kite, every weight of rider. That doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. There's brands out there that have some choices with tuning your lines to certain lengths or choosing a different length of line. So if you have that option, maybe get a few different sets, try out a couple different line lengths and just check what suits you best, because switching up your line length can actually make a really noticeable difference. I hope this has been helpful. It hasn't been as ranty as some would like, but hey, here we are. I'm still talking at you and you're not replying. Tune into the next one, or don't.